welcome to Sinolit. I'm very glad here today to have Dr. Lynn Struve with me, who has spent her professional career studying late imperial dynasty China, especially with regards to the Ming and Qing. And this book, Voices from the Ming-Qing Cataclysm, gives voice to the experiences of people during the Manchu invasion of China in the early 1600s at the end of the Ming. This account has stayed with me since I read it 6 months ago, so I'm very glad here today to have Dr. Lynn Struve with me. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to participate in this.
What got you interested in this subject matter to begin with?
I was interested in the period, the fall of a major dynasty, alien invasion, because of the sources and the nature of the sources from this period. And from a historian's point of view, that drew me to the idea of finding a period where there were many different voices, all expressing their views of what had happened. Because by that time, literacy had developed in China to, I can't say a high degree, but it had developed enough so that you had more than just the thin crust of the society leaving writings for posterity.
So you called your book China in the Tiger's Jaws, Hu Kou Yu Sheng, so coming out the mouth of the tiger.
Surviving
Yeah,
out of
that phrase was apt because this period comes across as awful. So I was wondering if we could set the scene a bit for our viewers. What was the situation like in the Ming Dynasty before the takeover?
For one thing, there were still tigers in China.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
Ming.
yes, there were.
And during times of disruption, the tigers could come out of the jungles or their lairs and could cause quite a bit of trouble or danger for the Chinese populace. So the idea of the fearsomeness of the tiger was fresh for those people. Nowadays, we give donations for our calendars that have these marvelous photos of tigers in captivity. And we think, oh, such a beautiful cat. You can see behind me my affinity for big cats. And we all think of them as sort of pets now. But it takes a little effort to project yourself back into a time when people had far less security than we have today. And when security broke down, one of the added things you had to worry about were wild animals, especially. It made an apt title for the book. The conditions were such that in the Ming period, of course, the Ming dynasty lasted for almost 300 years. It was one of the major dynasties of China. The people were, with any sense of history at all, during the Ming were very proud of the Ming period because it represented a restoration of majority Han Chinese rule over China. Prior to the Ming, for the first time in all of Chinese history, the whole subcontinent had been conquered by an alien people, the Mongols. And one has to acknowledge some extraordinary abilities of the Mongols, but rulership over an extensive agricultural domain was not one of their strengths.
They never lasted anywhere, did they?
And
In
they
any of
didn't
those?
last as long as the Chinese thought that a respectable dynasty should last. And so the Ming dynasty was founded on this pride of reestablishing majority Han Chinese rule over the subcontinent. This was very much shaken then in the 17th century when, oh no, not again.
Mm.
The barbarians, which is the generalized term that the Chinese used for people, especially from the north
Mhm.
of China, horseback riding peoples, who for various reasons had a proclivity to want to invade at least North China. Then, and to have the Manchus, who allied themselves with the Eastern Mongols, do this again was a tremendous shock especially to the elite who felt themselves responsible for maintaining social order and governmental order. So it was an extremely stressful time. When the Ming began, it was an extremely, I mean, things are really beaten down
Mm.
to really the ground level. But some of the reforms that the founders instituted at the beginning of the Ming, very, very slowly, but gradually had their effects. And one of these was literacy. It was Ming Taizu who established the first universal education system in China, and that important seeds were planted in the very early Ming for the steady growth of literacy through the Ming period. As we know from studying the history of literacy, growth in literacy is often accompanies development of the economy. We begin seeing a real, very marked economic uptick in the latter half of the 16th century. And the more complex the economy becomes, the more complex the governmental systems become for regulating and controlling and especially taxing that economic activity. So by the time you get to the early 17th century, these systems are at a quite a sophisticated level, markedly more so than in the previous 2 centuries. So when everything breaks down, that's a lot to break down.
Mm.
And when something breaks down here, it has a much larger and more likely effect on what goes on here than in previous times when there were just sort of micro economies.
1587, The Year of No Significance by Ray Huang is familiar to you. To what extent do you think the impasse of the Wanli Emperor just sort of backing away into hedonistic pleasure and not wanting to take on any responsibility or make decisions, to what extent do you think that fed into the terrible decline of the Ming?
I think that reign was really pivotal and unfortunately very long. It was during the Wanli period, enabled by the irresponsibility of the Wanli emperor, whom you can empathize with.
Hmm.
How would how would you turn
Yeah,
out? You were
yeah.
born into those circumstances. Okay, ask yourself that.
Hmm.
But the upshot was that he turned out the way he turned out, and he became resistant to doing his given job that necessitated that others move in to take up the slack. But in the Chinese system of governance, that kind of moving in to take up the slack of a non-performing emperor always was fraught with accusations,
Mm.
illegitimate exercise of power.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, Ming Taizu could do it all, but subsequently in the line of Ming emperors, which was not terribly stellar, there was a need for a right-hand man for the emperorship, but statutorily there was supposed to be none. Operationally, there had to be someone. And that duty increasingly fell upon the chief among the grand secretaries. And so the chief grand secretaries came to exercise more and more and more power over the bureaucracy. Many of in the bureaucracy didn't like that. And so it was convenient to attack the chief grand secretary as usurping illegitimate powers. So there was always an increasingly factionalized
Hmm.
dispute over the powers of the chief grand secretary. And during the Wanli reign, you really needed to have this kind of figure in the government, but there was endless dispute over anyone who actually tried to exercise that power. Well, I mean, the Wanli reign wasn't a complete failure. Well, and one thing that bears on what happened subsequently is that it was during the 1590s, right in the middle of the Wanli reign, that Hideyoshi, the Japanese warlord, decided to invade Korea. And Korea had always, long been a very loyal vassal of the Ming state in the sort of feudal arrangement of international relations of the Chinese. China was obligated not only on the principle of coming to the aid of a vassal state, but also just geopolitically, because they need to have a buffer. So the Ming state came very much to the aid of the Koreans in fighting the Japanese during what's called the Imjin War. And they did at length, with great expenditure of blood and treasure, managed to defeat the Hideyoshi's armies and expel the Japanese from the Korean peninsula. And the Koreans were ever grateful to the Ming, specifically to the Ming, for this, and in their hearts never accepted Qing rule. From the side of the Wanli reign of the Ming Dynasty, it was a tremendous expenditure, and it reduced the reserves of the dynasty quite seriously. And those reserves were never adequately built up again because following that, in the early 17th century, the Ming began to face internal rebellions. The Manchus, there was always a threat from the Eastern Mongols. And then the Manchus started up in the Northeast. And so those reserves never were reestablished after the Imjin War against the Japanese in Korea. So in several respects, the Wanli reign was very pivotal.
At the end of the day, the rebellions internally meant that the Manchus were invited in to deal with that problem, in part, and they stayed.
First, the Manchus first moved to subjugate the Korean court. Then they moved to defeat, strongly enough, the Eastern Mongols who were on their western border, and get some of the Eastern Mongols to actually join their enterprise, as Fred Wakeman's book says, the great enterprise that died yet. So when the Manchus finally invaded North China in force, they were in league with some of the most effective Eastern Mongols. And also they had started out in the northern part of Liaodong, the northern part of the Northeast, and they had very gradually conquered first the southeastern part of Liaodong, and then gradually conquered the western part of Liaodong, an area that was heavily populated by Han Chinese. So they had already brought into their ranks both Han Chinese military units and also literate Han Chinese.
Turncoats, yeah.
With written communication, and especially written communication to the Chinese populace and to the Chinese officials and generals. So they were prepared. They were prepared from all of these prior successes to then move on North China. They didn't do it suddenly all at once. They had made very extensive incursions into North China 2 or 3 times before 1644. So they were very well prepared. And the Chinese military had become very seriously demoralized by that point. And they were ready, many of them were ready to go over to a fighting organization that they saw as very effective and a leadership that respected martiality and martial success. And that was a great draw, aside from just saving one's own neck. Prospect of joining up with a much more effective military organization than they had under Ming rule.
In many cases, it fits with the cyclical nature of dynasties, in that you have a energy at the beginning, martial prowess, Zhuyanjiang, Ming Taizu on horseback, actually being a general himself, leading the army. And then at the end, you have people like the Wanli Emperor never even leaving the palace. So they're
Yes.
completely disconnected.
Well, there is scholarship that suggests fairly convincingly that he did he did fairly effectively lead the Indian wars. I mean, he wasn't out in the field, that's for sure. But at least he respected the generals
Mhm.
and didn't execute them for losing a battle,
Mm.
which is what was happening in after his
Mhm.
reign. But this, you're right to point to a certain cycle. I
Mm.
mean, any dynasty in China, in Chinese history,
Mhm.
and any major revolution that results in a fundamental change of
Mhm.
rulership in any country, it's very, very likely to be accomplished through arms
Mm.
and through warfare.
Mhm.
And so the founding of a dynasty often has very strong martial flavor to
Mhm.
it, strong martial values. But then if they succeed, what happens? They establish a long period of great peace.
Mm.
And who do you need to manage things during a long period of great peace and perhaps rising prosperity? You need civil officials. So the civil officials gain the status,
Mhm.
um, and in the case of China, the civil officials came to rather lord it over the military leaders who they tended to look down on as, you know, illiterate and uh, and having not proper
Mhm.
cultivation
Yeah.
values, and the institutional support of the military system in the Ming also became eroded through withdrawal of
Mhm.
funding and things like that, and so yes, peace breeds a loss of martial value, and it's very important to maintain that because it's going to be life or death when you need it.
Mm. History rhymes, doesn't it, Lin? History rhymes. Exactly the same thing happened with the Han Dynasty. At first, you have Liu Bang forming the rebellion that brought down the Qin and establishing the long-lived 400-year-long Han Dynasty. And in the end, they're inviting the horse peoples in again to deal with rebellious problems at the end. Different factors, differences of how long it takes to happen, but definite patterns. And in chapter 1, the Manchu insurgents are repeatedly referred to as bandits. And one thing I considered was to what extent, when an invading force is just being named as a bandit, to what extent is that actually boxing one's mind in to be able to deal with the problem? Because they're not actually identifying that these are invaders, they're not bandits.
Yes. There, another common term was Lu, which means slave. They
Mm.
called them slave
Mhm.
barbarians, and it was the term of choice during those days for diminishing the enemy. We have many ways of doing this in our culture um, today, of diminishing the humanity of anyone we see as a threat or who might need to be eliminated. So it makes the people who you want to support you feel that they need to support you because you're the one who's going to take care of these lessers. It does present a historical a problem for the historian because they did tend to put this blanket term on the enemy from the Chinese side and the Chinese sources. But it may also have been a recourse since they didn't know the names of the enemy forces. They didn't identify them exactly. Now, when you read these accounts of all of this destruction of life and property and everything, and killing of people en masse, and it's not always these barbarian types. A great deal of it is being done by erstwhile Han Chinese soldiers
Mhm.
of the Ming who have been co-opted and have gone over to the Qing, especially by the time they get to South China. The majority by number of the soldiers who are pressing the Qing cause. And I call it the Qing cause rather than the Manchu cause because most of them were not Manchus.
Mhm.
They were, some were Mongols, but you very seldom see any reference to a Mongol. They were mostly surrendered Chinese who had gone over to the Qing side and found it very lucrative.
Mm, indeed, yes. In 1679, only 27% of the land registered for cultivation was being actually cultivated, that was registered for cultivation in 1581. So it comes across as a really awful time for the people. So, what do you think this time was like in general for the common folk and for the literati and the gentry?
Very, very difficult.
Mm,
For the gentry and the upper classes, they were mainly landowners. Some held official positions and gained considerable income from holding official position, but you could never guarantee that your family would have office holders. And sometimes a member of one's family would only hold office for a few years.
mhm,
So you always had to have your land to fall back on to sustain your lifestyle, a lifestyle of learning and high literacy was that was fundamental to passing the civil service examinations and ever entering officialdom again. And people took a long-term view of their lineages, much more so than we moderns do now.
mhm,
And so their lands are very important. But when the system that protects them and their lands from the hoi polloi breaks down, they're mostly quite defenseless.
mm,
They have their tenants and they have some servants who can, wield a pike or something like that, but they're not really soldiers or policemen. And so the elite immediately becomes very, very vulnerable to having some of their land simply seized and occupied by other people, and they can't do anything about it. So they become very, very vulnerable when there's a breakdown in what we call law and order. And that is why the the cultural political elite, very readily, they were ready for
mhm,
any regime. They didn't care where they came from, any regime that could protect them and reestablish order.
mm,
So that's one of the reasons why the Manchus were able to take North China relatively easily. But the South was a different matter. The South had not experienced the roving rebel armies to that extent, the Southeast especially. And the elite looked to history and really didn't believe that the Manchus would come any farther south than they did. They thought the Manchus themselves identified with the earlier Jin dynasty um, that had also come out of
mm,
what we call Manchuria or the Chinese Northeast. And the Manchus themselves at an earlier point had identified themselves as the later Jin dynasty.
mm,
And so there was reason for the Han Chinese in the South to think that they'll be satisfied. And if we just put up some resistance along the Yangtze River, we can have a sort of northern Song, southern Song detente. And that's what they imagined. But the complete inexperience in leadership of the Ming princes, that also was an institutional matter. The Ming princes were not allowed to stay in the capital. They were sent out and established on small princedoms around the country. And they mostly just lived lives of leisure and had nothing to do with governance.
mhm,
So when suddenly they're called on to lead the nation, they were totally inexperienced. The Qing side perceived all of this and decided to make a go for it and take all of China. It
mm,
took them a long time.
mm. It did.
And you asked about that particular date of 1679.
Hmm.
By 1679, China had undergone not only the Qing conquest, which itself took decades, but also the Qing had undergone a major internal rebellion in the south. It's called the Rebellion of the Three Feudatories.
Hmm.
And this had broken out, started around 1674 and took 3 4 years. If it hadn't been for I mean, this is just a speculation on my part, but if the Qing hadn't been so extremely lucky
Mm.
to place on the throne such an extraordinary person as the Kangxi Emperor,
Mm.
it might very well have failed
Hmm.
at that. So by 1679, most of China had been through the ringer several times
Mm.
over.
It sounds really traumatic. One of the questions that keep coming back to me as I was reading your book throughout many quotes was just how often it seemed like the common folk may not have really even been aware of what had happened. So, for example, you have the example of Prince Regent announcing himself to the commoners, and many in the crowd speculating that he was a descendant of Yingzong, a Ming ruler who had been captured by the Mongols. So, like you were saying, many turncoats, Han Chinese, worked with the Qing. The common folk would have had little interaction with the Manzu people, and
Yeah,
they were off somewhere in a palace in the major cities across their country and leading the units, but they would not,
no,
many of
that's
them would have not known what really happened.
yes, exactly. I mean, again, it's very difficult for moderns to place themselves back in the information regime
Mm.
of pre-modern times. Yes, you never saw your higher rulers. You never you never would even see your county magistrate. He would be in a palanquin with the shades all drawn down, and no one would ever get a look at him. And then, so how did you get your information about mega events going on? It was mostly rumor and making analogies to the past,
Mm.
so far as you understood the past. And also, it was part of a strategy to either put out a rumor that would send hordes of people doing something that you wanted them to do, usually causing greater disruption, or to keep information back so that people wouldn't be alarmed. And
Mm.
we see that in the present day. We
Hmm.
have
Hmm.
events that occur and people don't know exactly who did it. They're in their minds. We instantly want to blame someone or some element for something awful that happened. Somebody puts out a rumor nowadays, usually online, that might be totally wrong, but it gets lots of people all ginned up. And you can, many examples of this in the United States and most recently in England, of this happening in a time when we have just so many sources of accurate
Hmm.
information. Or it doesn't hurt us a bit to just wait until we have more accurate information from a reliable source. Even so, we have so many people who want to leap onto something that they want to believe or something that strikes such fear into them that they just feel they have to act in some way before getting better information. It happens all too often, even in the present day, when we have so many sources of accurate information. So in pre-modern times, there were no newspapers, certainly no internet, no television, no radio, no electricity.
Hmm.
So how did you learn about things? You learned about things mostly from
Hmm.
hearsay. If you lived on occasions when you would go to a governing center, there would be billboards on which certain proclamations would be posted. You probably couldn't read them. Even in present day China, you have these extremely strong controls on information in mainland China, in the PRC. A lot of this is driven by fear of many people. And in China, that means a whole many people.
Hmm.
Many people getting an idea about something that produces luan
Hmm.
or chaos. And this is an age-old fear of the
Yeah.
Chinese governing class.
I mean, no different here for me, in England, that people go to prison for what they say on Facebook. Perhaps now it's more difficult to control the information because people have more avenues. Yeah, so that Manchu emperor being mistaken for a Ming emperor, he goes on to say later, because he wants them to shave off the head and grow a queue. He says because some civil servants didn't want to do that. It was a matter of their identity and they didn't want to go along with that. The quote is, "I preserved all your heads and now you cling to your hair." That's the quote.
Yes. Yes, and as they went to this was a major factor in the rebelliousness of the people in the South, because they started out with this head shaving order as a practical measure because they had so many Han Chinese join their military operations that, especially as they went forward in battle, they needed a way to distinguish their side
Mhm.
from the other side. So those Han Chinese military people who came over to the Qing side, they were required to adopt the Manchu head shaving style, so that the Manchus, when they got into a dicey situation, they could tell who was on their side and who wasn't.
Mm.
But then gradually they looked at this as a means of identifying who was loyal
It's a good
to
loyalty test.
their
Yeah,
regime and
yeah.
who was not.
Hmm.
And if you refused to shave your head, that became interpreted as you were a potential source of disloyalty and possibly rebellion against the order. So that would then be off with your head. So in South China, saying came to be, um, keep your hair or lose your head.
Hmm. That's the subject of, you may have heard of Philip Kuhn's book,
Yes.
Solstices.
And consequently, if some scurrilous element was going around chopping off people's
Mm.
pigtails,
Terrifying.
this meant that there was a seditious
Mm.
element in the populace that
Yeah.
to be dealt with firmly and quickly.
Mm.
It was an offense to their ancestors, and particularly an offense to their parents. It was extremely painful for especially the upper classes who were so conscious of the Confucian values, Confucian tradition, of filial piety,
A lot of my channel is devoted to watching and reviewing Chinese television. You can always identify post Qing by the queue. If it's post Qing, they have a pigtail like this in the front, and after that, if so, if the TV show's set post 1600s, you'll know it by the pigtail.
Yes, yes.
I thought that
It
would
was
be.
it was a great boon for barbers.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah. I was going to ask you about why someone like Hong Zhenzhou would become a turncoat. That you pretty much covered that earlier with, discussing about the
Mhm.
martial values of the Qing and,
Well,
soldierly
the
people.
consequences, I mean, in his situation, the consequences of not, I mean, he didn't turn coat immediately.
Mm,
He was defeated, or he was forced to surrender up in Liaodong.
mhm.
Uh, he was facing certain annihilation of his command, um, and of himself, and he surrendered. The Qing recognized what a valuable person he was.
Mm.
And so they didn't just execute him, they kept him under their control for some weeks.
Hmm.
And of course, putting various bargaining chips in front of him, for instance, thinking about your family
Mm. Mm.
and what will happen to your family if you are stubborn,
Mm.
uh, and etc. So they could put a tremendous amount of pressure,
Mm.
these surrendered uh, persons of value who they came under their
Mm.
control. Those who have gone down as great heroes and ended up being executed because they persisted in refusing to
Mm.
submit and serve
That's
this.
like Huang Daozhou,
Yes,
the man who led the resistance from the south.
yes, he's one example
Mm.
of many. They go down in these great heroes and exemplars of loyalty to king and country, in the history books, but their whole families were wiped out.
Mm.
And in Shirkuff's case, he had no son. He had to arrange with his wife by those letters I translated. One of the letters was to his wife,
Mm.
and he was telling his wife, since we have no son, and it was absolutely, absolutely necessary
Hmm.
for a man to have a son succeed him because it was thought that you had to carry on your lineage, your family line, but also because there had to be a male figure to do sacrifices to your spirit after death. And if not, then you would have wandering hungry
Hmm.
ghosts.
Hmm.
Uh, the lineage would be plagued with bad luck in subsequent generations. All this sort of belief. It was very important to have a son. So a lot of adoption occurred from a brother who had an extra son or a nephew who had an extra son who would be adopted over to succeed a member of the clan who was dying with no son. But in those letters, Shirkuff, one of them is to his wife, saying, I am designating my attaché, so and so, to be my my foremost son. And I want you, by this letter, I'm asking you to please accept him
Hmm.
as our son and treat him as our son for handling our family affairs going
Hmm.
forward. So, I mean, they could completely wipe out not only a man's immediate family, but if he really got into trouble, they could wipe out the entire
Mm.
lineage.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying they could, they did
Mm.
enough times to make this really terrifying
Mm.
for surrendered officials.
Mm.
And that's why I I really feel for Hong Chang-cho.
Mm.
His name is just a black name,
Hmm.
in traditional Chinese history. But if you really get into the situation of the man, he knew that the minute he became useless to the Qing, then not only he, but his whole family would be in peril. Because he had been an important, very important Ming official. He had many, many acquaintances among people who might still be Ming loyalists. So he would be under very, very high suspicion of sedition if they allowed him to go back to his ancestral home.
Mm.
He never did. They kept him in Beijing till the end of his life.
Mm.
Um, and so, then his eyesight is failing. And he's terrified that he's going to make some awful mistake in handling the campaigns because of his failing eyesight. He's not, anxiety is causing him to be of ill health in general, but they refuse to let him stop because
Mm.
he's so valuable to them. So he's really in a pickle. And I especially came to sympathize with him when I found this
Mm.
portrait from a very rare collection of his writings at the Academia Sinica. And you can see that the original text is water damaged. And it was water damaged across his face.
Hmm.
So I had that digitally cleaned up a little bit. But we usually think of traditional Chinese portraits like this as being very, very formalized,
Hmm.
and how, you really can't tell much at all about how the person really looked because they were so extremely formalized. But this counters that, or at least cuts into that standard attitude, because you can see in this portrait how gaunt he is, just being swallowed up by this enormous official robe.
Mm.
And the artist very, very effectively captures his unseeing eyes. So, if you think that Chinese portraiture doesn't really tell you anything, sometimes it really
Mm.
does.
Mm. Mm. Very poignant, yeah. Some passages really stuck with me. There's a person who escapes from the massacre of Yangzhou. All I intend is that people of later generations who are fortunate to live in a peaceful world and to enjoy uneventful times, but who neglect self cultivation and reflection and are inveterately profligate, will read this and be chastened. That really stuck with me. Kicks a bit of gusto into me when I'm feeling lazy or like I don't want to work anymore. That really
Well, I
stayed
hope
with me.
people will read these stories and think, oh, could this happen to me?
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
how would I conduct myself?
That's a heavy question to think about, isn't it? And I suppose one we can only know when it happens. We've gone over a lot of the heavy stuff and a silver lining. I know it is by its nature dark subject matter. At the same time, there are silver linings in there, like the
Oh, yeah.
artist's trek, chapter 11. There's a huge trek that a filial son goes on to find his parents. They're, as far as he knows, stuck in Yunnan. 1651, the man who would become an artist, Huang Xiangjian, off the top of my head,
Checking.
yeah, he goes on a 2,800-mile long trek to find his parents lost, as far as he knows, in the southwest China, Yunnan. And remember, at this time, that region was still far, far away. It's
And
almost off into the
very
clouds,
fraught,
isn't it? And
very fraught. Also, that mileage is as the crow flies.
yeah, he of course did a lot more than that. Yeah.
If he had a pedometer on
Hmm.
for all the steps he took
Hmm.
during, it would be
Yeah,
far many miles.
absolutely. And our viewers will be able to see the trek on the screen when this video comes on YouTube, because he became an artist at the end of this, and there are touching moments in there where he just comes across this man in the middle of nowhere, and he says, "Oh, I know your parents. They're in, and I can tell you where they are." He comes across Tiger's paw prints as well in his journey.
Tiger prints as deep as bowls.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I found that chapter very compelling. But how about yourself, Lynn? What chapter or perspective did you find most compelling?
Well, I liked Huang Xiangjian myself,
Hmm.
especially because he left a whole album. I chose the one that down at the bottom, you can see the tiny figures of him in the lead, and a couple of bears carrying small bamboo palanquins with his mother and father behind him, and then bringing up the rear is his cousin.
Mm.
Yes, I like that one, and of course, from the Chinese value of filial piety, this is even more compelling. That's why it
Mm.
became such a famous story. And you can see in the course of his narrative how the fact that he got so much help along the way was that when he told his story to anyone, I mean, Han Chinese like himself, or to an enemy was
Just for
kind
viewers,
of,
I'll note that the battles were still ongoing at this time in
oh,
the
yes.
south.
I
Just
mean,
just in case viewers were not
he
aware of
was
that.
just trying to,
Yeah.
weave his
Hmm.
way through all of this
Yeah.
danger, disruption, and wild territories. I mean, this is very undeveloped territory
Mm.
he had to go through, and just by hook or crook. But every time he told his story, even the barbarians would be moved by what he was doing. A whole lot of people had become separated from their parents, and they could empathize, even if they were not Confucians, they could empathize. And time and again, he's helped by people
Mm.
because he sincerely tells them his story.
I didn't want to leave the opportunity aside to read out the quote about the artist finding someone who could identify his family because I loved it. Um, he met a man named Chung. This is on chapter 11, page 171. And he met this man called Chung. His voice choked with sorrow for a long while he said, I'll go to the government office to look into your father's service history. Then you can know what's happened. And then eventually he finds his parents thanks to this mystery man named Chung, who we'll never know. But
Yes.
we know via this book.
Yeah,
the
man was able to take a considerable risk
Mhm.
to find out information from this complete stranger, because the stranger had told him very sincerely about something that really got to the heart of Chinese
Mm.
values.
Mhm. Yeah, that chapter was very moving.
From my point of view, the one I had the most fun with,
Mhm.
and from feedback I've had, one of the most pedagogical value is the one where about the Qing takeover, the siege of Changshu,
Mhm.
where I weave together 4 different genres of record that are all talking about the same events, but they're written by different
Mhm.
people in different genres of
Mhm.
writing. And I weave those together to show the different takes
Mhm.
that people in different social positions were
Mhm.
having on the situation.
Mhm.
The street ditties that I chose from the storybook. I
Yes.
had so much fun. I
This
mean, it's
I've got one here right in front of me. If that's all right, I'll refer to it now.
try it out and see if you can
Yes,
get the rhyme.
yes, we've got quotes from a local chronicle, and we've got quotes here from a storybook. Qi Feng Yi Bian. Is that
Yeah,
what you're
and from the
referring to?
storybook, I took the quatrains
Hmm.
that headed each chapter in the storybook.
So the first one I've got here: transfer troops when pressed by the enemy. That's the traitor's evasive specialty. Guns and ammunition are all grabbed away. Shimin will be called a bungler, probably. My last question would be, what takeaways did you come away with from writing this book overall?
Yes, I think the best takeaway is how important it is to really listen to people. We're all human beings, and sometimes we have great differences, but particularly in history, um, people differ from us by not just culture and language, but they differ from us in time. I study mostly intellectuals, they're mostly men. I'm very much always been irked by the idea that since I'm a woman, I should study women's history. And why? I'm a historian. I study the people who write things
Hmm.
that and read and that tell me things I want to find out about. But often my subjects are men. I'm just finishing a biography of a of a man, and I've tried to understand him through his voluminous writings. I just let them speak as much as we can, and try not to bring too many preconceptions to the listening.
Hmm.
And note that I'm not saying listen to them speak to you, because they're not speaking to you. They don't they can't imagine you, a person living in 21st century England or America or wherever you are reading an English language book. they're speaking, they're expressing themselves in a way that they hope someone at the other end is going to understand. Sometimes they're speaking for a posterity that they can imagine, but they're mostly just speaking, expressing what they feel and how they see things and what they have experienced. And if you really want to understand the past, you have to approach them and let them speak with as open a mind as
Mhm.
possible. And if you do that enough, it's really helpful to you in the present day,
Mhm.
trying to understand your Uncle Bill, who, who who you have to interact with now and then, but who you might have a great deal of difference with. Uh, or someone who lives down the block, to be not someone who you would care to communicate with, but they might be.
Mhm.
Give it a try. I also feel that it is helpful in mitigating against an overzealousness that I often see among professional historians in wanting to put abstract ideas about history onto
Mhm.
people of a
Yep.
time.
Yep.
It's become such that a topic is not worth pursuing if you cannot somehow link it with modernity.
Mhm.
Our thinking is led into the sources looking for things that seem modernistic. And that's why I've been attracted to these kinds of individual records. Cherish the librarians of the world. I have been helped in so many ways by so many wonderful librarians. I could not do my work, absolutely could not do my work if it weren't for the fantastic resources and services of excellent librarians. They might bring you things that you would never have discovered on your own. That frequently happened to me in China, in the rare books libraries that I spent many, many days and hours in China. Librarians of the world, one sway.
Thank you to all the librarians for this book spoken of and many things beyond that. This book link in the description to this video. Voices from the Ming Qing Cataclysm, China in the Tiger's Jaws. Thank you very much.
This has been delightful.